When we speak of large-scale synthesis and explanation, we have in mind the fact that systematic theologians continue the process of collating different aspects of biblical teachings. They use theological propositions to create larger, more complex theological syntheses. They form layers upon layers of biblical teachings until they've finished their discussion of a theological topic. In effect, doctrinal discussions consist of layers of syntheses and explanations of increasingly larger and more complex theological ideas. With these basic processes in mind, we should look at an example. By way of illustration, we'll look at Berkhof's discussion of objections to the theory of perfectionism, found in Part 4, Chapter 10 of his Systematic Theology. Perfectionism is the belief of some Christians that we can be entirely free of sin in this life. And in this section, Berkhof gathered biblical support for the negative goal of opposing this false view. In Berkhof's presentation, he first claimed that perfectionism is absolutely untenable in the light of Scripture. He then sought to prove his viewpoint in 3 lengthy paragraphs, each of which makes one basic claim. The first paragraph says, "The Bible gives assurance that there is no one on earth who does not sin." The second paragraph begins with this claim: "According to the Scripture, there is a constant warfare between the flesh and the spirit in the lives of God's children, and even the best of them are still striving for perfection." And his third paragraph begins, "Confession of sin and prayer for forgiveness are continually required in Scripture." Berkhof's presentation isn't difficult to understand. He argued that perfectionism is against the Scriptures because the Scriptures teach that everyone on earth sins, that all believers struggle with sin, and that everyone must confess and seek forgiveness. Now, while Berkhof's position can be understood in the order in which he presented it on paper, we want to work backwards to see how he garnered biblical support for his presentation. Berkhof either quoted or referred to 19 biblical passages. After gathering these verses into 3 groups, Berkhof formed propositions that he derived from these texts. In the first paragraph, he simply listed the first 6 biblical references and concluded, "The Bible gives us assurance that there is no one on earth who does not sin." In the second paragraph, Berkhof summarized each verse separately with a simple theological proposition. Referring to Romans chapter 7, verses 7 through 26, Berkhof wrote, "Paul gives a very striking description of this struggle, which certainly refers to him in his regenerate state." Referring to Galatians chapter 5, verses 16 through 24, he wrote that Paul speaks of a struggle that characterizes all the children of God. Referring to Philippians chapter 3, verses 10 through 14, he said that Paul speaks of himself practically at the end of his career as one who has not yet reached perfection. After forming these propositions from Scripture, he took his 3 propositions and synthesized them into one broader truth. As he put it, according to the Scripture, there is a constant warfare between the flesh and the spirit in the lives of God's children, and even the best of them are still striving for perfection. In the third paragraph, Berkhof continued to summarize verses with simple propositions. First, he referred to Matthew chapter 6, verses 12 and 13, writing these words, "Jesus taught all his disciples to pray for the forgiveness of sins." Then he simply quoted 1 John chapter 1, verse 9, implying that it repeated the same theme. Next, Berkhof referred to verses from Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Isaiah, Daniel, and Romans that repeat examples of holy men praying for forgiveness. And on the basis of these verses, he formed this proposition: Bible saints are constantly represented as confessing their sins. After forming these propositions from Scripture, he synthesized his two more basic theological propositions into a higher claim that confession of sin and prayer for forgiveness are continually required in Scripture. So we see that Berkhof developed three main biblical claims in his discussion of the doctrine of perfectionism, one in each paragraph, through ever larger and more complex layers of synthesis and explanation. In the first paragraph, he asserted, the Bible gives assurance that there is no one on earth who does not sin. In the second paragraph, he asserted, according to the Scripture, there is a constant warfare between the flesh and the spirit in the lives of God's children, and even the best of them are still striving for perfection. And in the third paragraph, he asserted, confession of sin and prayer for forgiveness are continually required in Scripture. Then, to complete this doctrinal discussion of perfectionism, Berkhof brought these three assertions to an even higher level of synthesis. He concluded, in the light of Scripture, the doctrine of perfectionism is absolutely untenable.